This is the OECD's speaker series on the theme of empowering public understanding. The premise is simple enough. So basically, we can't really rely on technical tools anymore, be it medium-term frameworks or spending reviews. If we want to tackle some of the major long-term challenges that we face, things like debt sustainability, climate, aging pressures, the feeling is that we need more. And what we think we need is basically public legitimacy. And by that, we mean buy-in from the broader public, that we empower citizens with an understanding of the risks, the trade-offs, and why inaction will leave us worse off collectively. So crucially, that requires us to communicate rational ideas effectively. And now when I was asked for ideas for speakers for this series, I thought, well, if there was one person I could have, it would be Steven Pinker, who's thankfully here today. And the reason is that his writing has been a huge influence on our work in this space at the OECD in terms of how we communicate effectively on very complex topics to the public at large. But also his work has been a shining light for me personally. I remember The Blank Slate being published when I was 17, and I've followed his work very closely ever since. Steven Pinker, for those of you that don't know, he's a professor of psychology in the Johnstone family professor at Harvard. He's an experimental psychologist conducting research on language, cognition, social relations. He's in Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world today, a two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, and author of 12 books, including classics such as Enlightenment Now, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Rationality, and The Sense of Style. In his work, he argues that we must push back against our biases as humans, and see the world as it truly is. And that means things that are very relevant for us that are involved in policy. Professor Steven Pinker, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So it's morning time there, and I thought I'd start with a classic icebreaker. So you've famously argued that we live in an attention economy with lots of focus on from the media on headlines that are sometimes jarring, sometimes a little bit worrying. What do you do yourself when it comes to news in the morning? Do you follow it very carefully, or do you try to actively avoid it?
I do follow the news. It's a habit that I've had since I was a teenager, of reading the newspaper. Now, of course, now it's a screen rather than newsprint. But I steel myself for the news, and the morning is the time when I read it. Yes, it's not the only thing that I read. I also subscribe to a number of feeds that gather the significant positive developments in the world and report them. And by that, I don't mean human interest fluff, like a photo of a puppy with an orangutan. I mean significant developments like countries that have eradicated a disease, or large areas that have been set aside for conservation, or advances in human rights laws in some country, because there are a lot of them and they tend to be underreported. And so I balance the non-random sample in mainstream media, which tends primarily to consist of disasters, catastrophes, not just because editors have a negativity bias, which they do, but also that if you're reporting events, any event that occurs at a discrete time on a discrete day is probably going to be bad, just because there's so many more ways for things to go wrong than to go right. And so unless you actively look for positive developments, and again, not just feel-good stories, but really significant developments like the eradication of an entire disease in an entire country, then you're apt to miss them and get I think, an overly depressing view of the state of the world.
Yeah, I think there's lessons for those of us involved in policy in that respect as well, because very often we're tempted to write about the areas that need changing or fixing, but we often forget the things that have been working well. And also, we tend not to maybe finish reports or writing with things that are constructive, that, these are ways we can solve some of the problems we're talking about.
Indeed. And because I've written two books chronicling quantifiable progress, decline over the decades in war deaths, in infant mortality, in homicide deaths, in extreme poverty, and so on. People congratulate me for being an optimist, which actually isn't really the point. It's not a question of seeing the glass as half full or looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, but it's just attending to data and trends rather than events. And when you do, you do get a different picture of the world because a lot of things, for example, the massive decline in extreme poverty worldwide, the fact that extreme poverty is less than 9% of the world's population, that 100,000 people escape from extreme poverty every day, and that's been true for 30 years. It's clearly one of the most important developments in the history of the planet, and most people aren't aware of it. Now, some people say, well, if you it's important to concentrate on the negative trends because otherwise we'll be complacent. We will, I think everything is going fine, so there's no need to do anything, which of course is we ought not to do. We ought not to be complacent. But yeah, I think a diet that is too dominated by negative developments can actually lead to the opposite. It can lead to fatalism. It can lead to disengagement. It can lead to a feeling of, well, there's always going to be another problem tomorrow. They're all intractable. We're in the middle of a polycrisis. There's nothing anything can do about it. So I think I'll just, entertain myself. I actually think that being aware of the fact that problems can be mitigated, sometimes they can be solved, is empowering.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we heard last week. So we were talking to the Oxford Reuters Institute and Nick Newman, and he was saying that more and more we're seeing people disengage from the news for those very reasons. And you deal with some of the problems that are linked to that, coordination problems in your new book quite a bit when everyone knows that everyone knows. And there's some overlap with economics that's really lovely in that. One problem you note is that for some economists, at least, that people develop hypersensitive antennae for what they say. And I think this is very true of central bankers, for example, but also finance ministries and the like. And their statements act as focal points because many macro phenomena depend on expectations. Now, we know that we can see inflation spirals, we can see recessions that are self-fulfilling a little bit if it relates to fears of job losses and they feed on themselves. And we end up with lots of economists, you say, as a result, describing the world in precisely vague ways. And I think you give a lovely example of Alan Greenspan talking about this. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes. So my new book, When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows, dot, 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 Common Knowledge and the Mysteries of Money, Power, and Everyday Life, is on the difference between private knowledge, where everyone knows something, and common knowledge in the technical sense of the term, when everyone knows something, everyone knows that everyone knows that thing, everyone knows that, and so on ad infinitum. Now, that seems impossible because when you start to think about, what does she think that I think that she thinks that I think that she thinks, your head starts to spin. But common knowledge can be generated at a stroke when an event is public or self-evident or salient or conspicuous. That is, if you see something happening at the same time as you see other people see it happening or hear it, that instantly generates the sense that everyone knows that everyone knows. And that sense is necessary for coordination. That is, for people to be on the same page for doing something that benefits everyone as long as everyone does it in the same way. Now, often that's highly beneficial. Say driving on the right versus driving on the left. There's no reason to pick one side or the other, but there's every reason to pick the same side that everyone else picks, whether it be left or the right. Paper currency is another example. It's a euro has value because I think that other people think that other people think that other people think that it has value, and so on. Now, as you alluded to, since common knowledge generally, although it can consist of people getting inside other people's heads, getting inside other people's heads, and that does happen in events like a bank run, where people might withdraw their money from a bank not even because they think the bank is insolvent, but because they think that other people think it, and that other people think that other people think it, and they don't want to be left um, holding the bag if everyone else withdraws their savings and the bank goes under. So they withdraw their savings, which in turn spreads the fear that everyone will withdraw their savings and makes the bank fail even if it was solvent in the first place. And of course, that can happen to burst bubbles, entire economies, resulting in depressions, which used to be called panics, simply because that's what fueled them. And so when Franklin Roosevelt said during the Great Depression, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, that was actually a technically accurate statement. It wasn't just a feel-good bromide. And so going
Um,
back to the example that you cite, since people, especially investors and people in the financial sector, private or public, are always on the lookout for any public signal that could lead other people to fear that other people are doing something. The central bankers have to watch their words very carefully, as in Alan Greenspan's notorious statement: "If since I've been a central banker, I learned to mumble with great incoherence. If you think I've been clear, you haven't understood what I said." It was a bit of a joke, but there was some truth to it, in that a a word from a central banker that would seem to prophesy a rate cut or a rate increase can then become self-fulfilling in inflating a bubble or in triggering a crash.
and there's a certain element of covering the anatomy involved with that as well, right? It maybe leads you a bit of a get out of jail card if you can avoid saying things that are going to lead to bigger impacts, right?
Indeed, yes. And a lot of the art of politics is framing messages so that it will please one constituency without offending another one. And I have an entire chapter in the book. In fact, this is how I got into the entire topic on euphemism, innuendo. The chapter is called Weasel Words, about the way in which we avoid blurting out what we actually mean, but we want to get the message across, and so we veil our intentions in innuendo and doublespeak, in everything from veiled threats and bribes to sexual come-ons to fundraising appeals. And I suggest the reason that we do that is that our language does two things at once. It conveys information, but it also establishes what kind of relationship we have. Are we in a relationship of communal friendship, of authority and deference, of being transactional partners? And every message carries with it the signal as to what kind of relationship we have. Sometimes we have to convey a message and we don't want to threaten a relationship. We want to, might want to say, bribe a maitre d' at a restaurant without disrespecting him. We might want to offer a sexual feeler to a platonic friend without challenging the friendship if the other party refuses. Many cases like that, and that's why so much of language is indirect. And it's as a psychologist who studies language, that's what opened up the entire world of common knowledge to me.
And staying with the theme of, say, communication and coordination failures, one of the big aspects that we see in budgets today, especially if we think about the climate transition, and I know you've discussed this with Bill Gates and others. What is your thinking now about how governments can better overcome the tragedy of commons when it comes to, say, climate, and how we can create the political will for action on that front?
Yeah, I think there are two trains of thought that I've had on that. One of them is, like, pretty much every economist, every expert, I think that carbon pricing, ideally a carbon tax, is the most direct way of dealing with climate change. That you just have people, as they say, or have the government internalize the externalities. So if you're causing harm by releasing greenhouse gases by burning fossil fuels, you should pay for it. That changes the incentives so that everyone can use their own ingenuity to figure out how best to to avoid greenhouse gas emissions. The problem, as we all know, is that people hate carbon taxes. Um, and so there are really two challenges there. One of them is how to compensate the people who suffer the most from carbon taxes, because they are regressive, and it's the truck drivers and the farmers and so on. So, and they really shouldn't be bearing the burden. So, and there can be various sweeteners and tax shifts. Al Gore had a slogan a couple of decades ago of supporting the idea of replacing income taxes with carbon taxes. And he had the slogan, tax what you burn, not what you earn. Didn't catch on, unfortunately. And it still is a tough sell. People hate carbon taxes. They put on yellow vests and they set cars on fire. So part of it is how to sweeten a carbon tax so that it is not regressive. And the other is how just not to so much of our many of our political and economic beliefs just depend on whether they're branded as left wing or right wing. And this is especially true in the United States, but more and more true in Europe as well, because of political polarization. You give people the same policy idea, and you say this is what was proposed by the left of center party. Then everyone on the left loves it, everyone on the right hates it. You have the exact same policy, and you say this was proposed by the right wing party, and then the agreement flips. And so part of the challenge is to propose it as not coming from the other political tribe so that people won't reflexively oppose it out of political tribalism. Anyway, that's one line of attack. And yet another problem is, of course, that even if it works within a country, then there's the problem of the global commons. If people feel that China and Indonesia and India are going to continue to burn coal, they're going to feel, why should I sacrifice my lifestyle for something that's going to make no difference to the planet anyway, given that the majority of greenhouse gas emissions come from the global east and south. So that's one line of analysis, but ultimately, I think the most effective one is going to be technological. That is, if clean energy is cheaper than dirty energy, people just acting in their self-interest will opt for clean energy. And a lot of these problems will just be circumvented, regulation and taxes and so on. They'll just do what's in their own interests. And so processes that, including battery storage, solar and wind, of course, but I suspect also a new generation of nuclear power to provide abundant energy, abundant clean energy, cheaper than fossil fuels, together with industrial processes like the creation of fertilizer and steel and cement, where the clean option is cheaper than the dirty option. I suspect that's going to be the most effective way of dealing with climate change.
I think that makes a lot of sense. You can imagine it becoming a focal point at a certain stage when everyone realizes that, well, look, this is cheaper and there's less pollution attached to it, less risks. It just makes sense to move. But it's really a question of when we hit that point, right?
Exactly. And and we haven't hit it right now. The fossil fuels have a big advantage there. They're cheap, they're abundant, they're portable, they're dense, and it's a tall order to get people to abandon them. Now, of course, in many parts of the world, in many sectors, they have when solar energy is abundant, although there's still the problem of the intermittency, which is why I think the combination of the intermittency of weather-dependent sources of energy like wind and solar, combined with the fact that that one inevitable fact of human history is that people develop more and more of a hunger for energy. You need energy to do anything. And we did, 10 years ago, we didn't even realize in thinking about carbon emissions that on top of all of the demands for fossil fuels, there's going to be crypto and AI and data centers more generally. And so there's even more demand for electricity, which means that abundant clean sources, I think, are the main solution that we have to look toward.
And like returning to these broader challenges that are facing policymakers, and if we think again about communications a bit more, so now we're focusing on a lot on this aspect of things a lot at the OECD at the moment, because the feeling is if the public doesn't understand why difficult decisions around these areas need to be made, then policymakers feel stuck. They feel that there's a bit of a paralysis setting in that if they can't communicate it, if the broader public doesn't understand, well, we're not going to take the hit and make these difficult decisions. So communications becomes vital then for all of the experts involved, as well as the policymakers. And you revisit the idea of the curse of knowledge in your latest book. and you've covered it very well in the sense of style too. You call it the root of bad prose, and it's basically our use of jargon and abbreviations and abstractions. Why do you think it's so pervasive among experts to use this when you say that, even children at a young age start to learn about a theory of other people's minds and they start to kind of realize what other people don't know? Why do experts, even as adults, still do this?
Well, experts know so much more, and because they're experts, they've spent their lives thinking about complex phenomena, abstractions, like quantitative easing. It would take a long time to explain what quantitative easing means. Uh, and on the other hand, if you're an economist, if you're a policymaker, this is because of a cognitive process called chunking, namely a very complicated multi-part concept turns into a unit when you think about it enough, you practice it enough, becomes a single entity that you could bring to mind in a stroke. You can give a label to it. That's extremely powerful. It's what allows us to be smart. On the other hand, it gets in the way of communication because your chunks, which depend on your experience, your practice, are not my chunks. So you can use a word for something that's totally clear to you, and it's utterly opaque to me. And that is, you're right that in the sense of style, my writing style manual, I identify that as the major cause of incomprehensible prose in legalese, in corporateese, in government bureaucraties, government speak. This differs from the most common interpretation that I hear, which is almost a conspiracy theory, which is that experts like to baffle people, to bamboozle people, to fluff up their own credentials. So they deliberately are obscure to show how sophisticated they are. Now, I'm sure that happens, but I don't think it's the main explanation, just because I know, even looking at my own prose that I wrote, a couple of months ago, saying, it's like, well, geez, how are readers supposed to know what I meant? I don't even know what I meant. So I think that cognitive block, the inability to unwind all of your own expertise, to develop the empathy, to put yourself in the shoes of a reader who doesn't know what you know, I think that's the main challenge of clarity in communication. Now, by the way, I won't go on too long, but let me also mention that a parallel challenge in communication, together with clarity, is credibility. And when it comes to having people uh, 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 trust the wisdom, the knowledge of experts, a lot of it is not a question of clarity, but whether they actually treat them as legitimate experts or as just priests of some rival cult or tribe. This gets back to political polarization that we spoke about a couple of minutes ago, that people will just blow off the advice or analysis of experts if they just think they're hacks for the other party. So part of the challenge of establishing credibility is to not brand yourself as a spokesperson for one political tribe or another, and to, I think, show your work to explain why you came up with the analysis you did. Now, of course, if you're an expert, it's very hard to reconstruct everything, and often it's very complex. But to the extent that a conclusion or advice is accompanied by some train of justification, and it's stripped of any clear identification with one party or another, that goes part of the way towards solving the credibility problem, which again is separate from the clarity problem.
I think that resonates a lot as well with some of the work we do. So we work a lot with independent fiscal councils and budget offices like the Congressional Budget Office in the US and the PBO in Canada and the OBR in the UK. And all these bodies, they really cherish their independence, but also their transparency in terms of presenting everything that they work on and how they've developed their findings. Um, one other question, and maybe I'll wrap up shortly after that. One real bugbear I have with reading economics writing is, and you pick up on this, is the layers and layers we get of nested clauses where people are basically trying to caveat everything they've said and explain that, well, the world is really uncertain. And so they list all of the uncertainties. And it can lead to kind of really impenetrable writing. And I think it can turn people off as well. Is it necessary, or do you think it's just overkill?
Yes, so you're right in pointing to another source of of unclarity and obfuscation that um, often people are writing for two audiences. There's the larger audience out there that wants to learn about the results of their analysis and research, but people are also terrified of how they'll be judged by their peers. And since it's necessary always to simplify, you can't involve people in every last uh, 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 caveat, reservation, um, opposing viewpoint. Otherwise, you'll just be inviting them to an academic seminar. Um, but on the other hand, you're aware that your peers will be judging you by what you write, and so you want to cover, as you say, cover your anatomy. That tension is often resolved too much on the side of defensive writing, and so a lot of academies uh, is difficult to penetrate because academics are so terrified of being seen as unsophisticated by their peers that they cloud their prose in apologies and vagueness. Now, there's no correct answer as to how to do it because you don't want to oversimplify. But often, um, I think to reach a larger audience, if you're an expert, you have to decide when is justified to just set aside some of the controversy, some of the footnotes, the caveats, the nitpicks, and what is a justifiable conclusion. Perhaps with links, with footnotes, you don't want to be irresponsible, but you don't want everything to be a graduate seminar.
Is there anything that frustrates you personally when you listen to experts or, say, policymakers talking about budgets?
Certainly, overuse of jargon, of abbreviations that aren't explained, um, of of prose where you kind of had to be there and be part of their training and their thinking to even understand what they're talking about. Now, again, as with many cases of communication, there's no correct answer because there's audiences are always a mixture of people with different levels of expertise. You want to provide enough justification so that you're not dogmatically making pronouncements, but not so much that people get bogged down and never come to any conclusion about anything. So that's why what one could say that clear communication has something of an art to it, by which I mean it's a matter of judgment of balancing different considerations rather than following a an algorithm or a perfect playbook.
That's a really good point. And before we go to Q&A, just one last thing. So you've spent your life thinking about how people think. How do you think people think about national budgets? Because I suppose when we look at them, we know that we're dealing with incredible numbers, and often in billions and trillions, and it's very diffuse as well. So it's spread across huge tax systems or military budgets or expenditure budgets that's really spread across a whole economy. And it's very hard for people to get a tangible sense of what that means. Do you think there's ways to make it more concrete for people?
It's a really important problem. I think it's unsolved. I don't think people have recognized it's a problem. But I got to confess myself that I get sometimes confused over when it comes to say the budget of the United States, the GDP of the United States, the GDP of all the OECD countries. Is it hundreds of billions? Is it trillions? Uh, People our own number sense is really what nature gave us is kind of one, two, and many when it comes to actual quantities, or an analog scale of more or less. But when it comes to huge, precise numbers like billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions, or in the case of energy, megawatts, gigawatts, terawatts, um, our mind starts to reel. And so I think it is helpful. I don't think enough people have given enough attention to our problem of scale insensitivity. The human mind just does not easily think in scale. And of course, when it comes to things like budgets, that's what it's all about. And so ways of perhaps giving people benchmarks or calibrations of that might accompany an article about, say, the budget. And we, by the way, we know from public opinion polls that people are completely out to lunch, just way off in terms of even proportions of a budget, let alone absolute numbers. And that recently became clear when in the United States, when Elon Musk, when he was part of the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, gutted the foreign aid budget, probably resulting in millions of deaths in poor countries from cutbacks in public health. Most Americans think that 10% of the budget goes to foreign aid. In reality, it's about 1%. So the percentages are not understood, and the magnitudes, and probably maybe anchoring things in just reminders. The U.S. budget or the EU budget is, such and such as a way of comparison. X percent is military, X percent is social welfare. If every news article that mentions a number also anchors people in what that number is a percentage of, I think that would enormously help in public communication.
Yeah, giving people a sense of perspective, right?
And when it comes to energy, for example, what does a household use in a year? What does a city of 1 million people use in a year? What does a power plant? Just adding a paragraph or an infographic, a couple of sentences even, to anchor people instead of just throwing out numbers which most of the time are utterly meaningless to people.
Okay, so we'll open the floor to Q&A in a second, but before I do, I just want to thank you again. This has been a real pleasure. Stephen Pinker, thanks so much.
Thank you, Eddie. It's been a pleasure and an honor.